my name is Matt Workman. I'm a freelance cinematographer, and my latest projects include commercials for Facebook, Google, and BMW. In this course, we're going to learn the fundamentals of composition and camera movement. Some of the key takeaways from watching this course include understanding aspect ratio and the rule of thirds, learning about the different types of shot sizes like wide shot, medium, and close-up, understanding and identifying the three main reasons that filmmakers move the camera, and finally, taking a look at the camera tripod, the camera dolly, and the camera crane. We're going to be looking at each one of those individually, looking at how they move the camera, and then looking at a couple example shots from each one. By the end of the training, you'll have been introduced to the fundamental concepts of both composition and camera movement. I'm excited to share these tips and techniques with you, so let's get started with the first lesson. So let's talk about aspect ratio. It's kind of a technical term, but we're going to go over it in as simple a way as we can so that you'll understand it. And it's really important. It's going to be one of the first things that you have to identify as a filmmaker is what aspect ratio you want to use on your film. A great way to think about aspect ratio is simply the relationship of the width and the height of an image. And it's in that order specifically. So let's look at a really, really simple example. And I think this is the simplest aspect ratio there is 1:1. Now, if you think about the original Instagram app, all the photos were square. And a square has an aspect ratio of 1:1. So it's literally 1 unit by 1 unit. Now, if you're thinking about back when you were watching VHS videos, that aspect ratio was 4:3. So it was 4 units wide by 3 units tall. So it was close to square, it was just a little bit wide. Now, if we think about cinema, so movies you'd go see in the theater, those aspect ratios range from about 1.78 to 1 to 2.35 to 1. And 1.78 to 1 is about, something like this. And 2.35 is something like this. So those were some of the aspect ratios of the past, and they're still present. But what's the number one most prevalent aspect ratio today? That's 16:9. 16:9 is roughly 1.78 to 1. It's something like this. You'll see 16:9 when you're watching YouTube. You'll see it when you're watching television, HD TV. HD is technically 16:9, so that's either 1920 by 1080, or it's 1280 by 720. Those are the image resolutions, and those are the aspect ratios. They're all 16:9. The video you're watching right now, also 16:9 online. The history behind the different aspect ratios is really interesting. Basically what happened is that there were all these different formats, all these aspect ratios, and it was a mess for for the manufacturers and the engineers to basically show all these different aspect ratios. So what they did is they took basically 4:3, which is one of the most common formats, and 2.35, and they averaged them together, and that turned out to be 16:9. So to summarize, aspect ratio is nothing more than the relationship between the width and height of an image. Historically, there's been 1:1 on Instagram, there's been 4:3 for VHS, and now these days we're looking at a lot of imagery that's 16:9 that's going to be on YouTube, and that's what your HD TV channels are going to also be showing you. Next, we're going to talk about a way to divide up the frame, and it doesn't matter what aspect ratio you're working with, but filmmakers and artists need a way to describe where something is in the frame. So we're going to be talking about the rule of thirds next. So let's talk about the rule of thirds. What is the rule of thirds, and how do we use it as a filmmaker? Why is it important? Why does everybody talk about the rule of thirds? We're going to talk about that right now. So regardless of aspect ratio, it could be a square, it could be 16:9, it could be 2.35. The rule of thirds is a way of dividing up that frame into 9 even parts. And the way you get those 9 even parts are dividing the frame evenly into 3 sections, both vertically and then horizontally. So you get this grid of 9 squares, or 9 rectangles. What you use this grid for is to communicate where something is in that frame. It's a system, it's a framework, and it's language that's universal for most creatives working in the film industry, that when you're looking at the frame, you can now say that, you know what, the object that's in the top third, on the left third, let's move that to the right third. So you're able to communicate something visually with language, with a system. It's really important to understand the rule of thirds and to be able to use it when you're communicating where things are in the frame. So we've talked about aspect ratio and we've talked about the rule of thirds. And before we get on to talk about shot size, I want to tell you a little story that I was told when I was first getting my start as a DP and camera operator. So the story goes like this. A young DP, like myself at the time, asks a more experienced DP, how do I operate the camera? How do I deal with the rule of thirds? How do I deal with headroom? Like what am I supposed to do? Like, it's such a big topic. Like, how do I approach this? And the experienced DP told the younger DP that all you have to do is you put the talker in the box. It's kind of a silly story, and but it's one that I come back to all the time. And what he basically meant by saying you put the talker in the box is that you take the person that's talking, in this case it would be me, and you put them in the box, which is the frame. And that is all we're doing. So we don't want to overcomplicate things. You know, in 90% of cinema, you are putting the talker in the box. You're putting someone's face in different ways in the box, and you want to see them talk, and you want to hear them talk, and that's all we're doing. But as we progress through our career, we want to have ways of more elegantly putting the talker in the box, and that's why we have the rule of thirds and the composition rules based on them, and that's why we have different shot sizes. So if you made it through that story about putting the talker in the box, we're going to be talking about the different ways you put talkers in boxes and how we describe those. So like I said, I think 90% of cinema is probably people in a box, right? I just made that statistic up, but that's by and large what we're watching. We're watching people talk, we're watching them walk to places, and we're watching them do things. So what becomes important is having a way of describing and systematizing the different sizes of shots. So when I say size of shot, you've probably heard a lot of these terms before. We're talking about the wide shot, and we're talking about close-ups. So we're going to go through all the different classes and categories of shot size there are, and just know that these are both universal terms that are used pretty much worldwide with filmmaking, but at the same time, they're pretty loose and open to interpretation. So let's talk about a wide shot. Like we said before, a wide shot is generally a shot of a person where you can see at least from their head to their toes, so you can see their entire body. And it could be even wider, a shot of a person walking down the block where they're very small in frame, that's still technically a wide shot. A wide shot can also be a wide shot of a car, a wide shot of a building, and it essentially means that you're seeing the entire object that we're talking about. Next, let's talk about a medium shot. A medium shot is generally where you can see from the person's head to the middle of their legs, roughly. You know, technically, I think a medium shot could be any shot that's inside of a person where you don't see their entire body. But in general, when we're in the filmmaking community and we say a medium shot, it's generally from their head to somewhere in their legs. A very specific and common use of a medium shot, and this is actually used in Europe, is called a cowboy shot, or an American shot, is where the shot goes from, again, their head to their mid-thigh. And in Westerns, that was used to show a shot where you see the person's face or the back of their head, and you would see where they were keeping their gun, which is about their thigh level. Next, we move on to the medium close-up. So we're moving from wide to close. We're going to talk about the medium close-up, or the MCU. This is, again, generally a shot where you're going to see from the top of the person's head to somewhere in their torso. So a medium shot, again, was something where you'd see from their head to the mid of their leg. A medium close-up is something where you're going to see from the top of their head to the medium of their body. This shot is probably the most common shot that you're going to see in everything. It's super common in soap operas. I think soap operas are almost 100% medium close-ups. It's going to be used for interviews, and it's going to be used for a large portion of any narrative film. Anything wider, you don't see that much detail in the person's face, the acting, and anything closer, you start to get not like uncomfortable, but you're very close to the person. It's very detailed, and you probably wouldn't want to watch a movie that was entirely in close-up or entirely in wide shot. The medium close-up is kind of that hero shot. It's the shot that you see everywhere. So next is the close-up, or the CU. The close-up is a shot that, again, generally goes from the person's head to their neck. Now, a close-up, in my mind, this is the way that I think about it, and this is the way that I use it as a filmmaker, is that a close-up, you usually see the entire head. So from head to chin. And the difference between a close-up and a medium close-up is pretty fine. But in general, like you're really focusing on the face, but you see the whole head. And you're going to see this a lot for dramatic emphasis when there's a really serious line, or as maybe a B camera shot to an interview, where the first one would be a medium close-up and the second one would be a little bit closer, and you could edit those two together. Now, the very last class of shot sizes is the extreme close-up, or the ECU. And my definition for that is anywhere where you see inside of the head. So the close-up showed all of the head, or most of it, and an extreme close-up means that you're shooting inside of the head. And this is the terminology that I use regarding extreme close-ups. You can use whatever you want. You can redefine them with your creative team, but just know that these are the general concepts and terminology that it goes to that filmmakers use when you're talking about shot sizes. So let's summarize the different shot sizes we've talked about so far. We have the wide shot, where you're going to see head to toe of a person, or wider. We have the medium shot, where you're going to see from head to middle of the legs. A common example is the cowboy shot or the American shot if you're in Europe. Next, getting even tighter is the medium close-up, where we're going to see from top of the head to in the chest, somewhere, anywhere in here. Next, we're moving into the close-up, which is primarily focused on the head, and you generally see the entire head when you're doing a close-up. And then finally is the extreme close-up, where if we're talking about shooting an extreme close-up of a person's face, you're framing inside of their face. So something like their eyes, their mouth, something like this, I don't know. That's an extreme close-up. So for the rest of the course, we're going to be looking at the different types of camera support that filmmakers use and how they move the camera. What I want to do before that is make the distinction between camera movement and camera rotation. And this is important because if you're on a live-action film set, if the camera rotates or if it moves, filmmakers refer to that as a camera movement just in general. So rotation and movement to a filmmaker is just called a camera move. And it makes sense if you've been on set. It basically means if the frame changes, which can happen through rotation or translation, that it's a camera movement and people need to be aware of that. But what I want to do now is try to break down the difference between camera movement and camera rotation. And I want to give these axes, and we're going to be using the Cartesian coordinate system that's present in software like Autodesk Maya and 3D Max, to be able to codify and systematize and explain and use language to describe camera movement and rotation. So let's start with camera movement. If we think simply of a ball, right, a sphere, and we want to physically move its position, what we do in 3D is we give each axis of movement, so either this way, or this way, we assign each one of those an axis, and we assign each one of those a letter, and the letters are X, Y, and Z. If you work in 3D, this is really familiar, but if you're only familiar with live action, or you haven't done either, this is kind of a new concept, and it's the Cartesian coordinate system. It's something you could Google and research and do a little bit more in-depth research on, but we're going to try to break it down for you in terms of camera movement right now. So the axis that goes from me to you, or to the camera, like this, so things are moving in and out, closer and further to you, that's the Z-axis. So if a camera moves towards something, it's usually moving on the Z-axis. That's one way to think about it. Now, if the ball or the camera moves this way, this is the X-axis. So that's moving kind of perpendicular to you. So again, we have Z and we have X. Try to memorize these. These are really important, and they're going to really set you apart if you're transitioning between 3D and real-world filmmaking. It's a way that is common, and it's very universal, a way to describe translation. So again, we have Z and we have X. And the final axis is the one that's vertical, that's up and down. So Z, X, and the last one that goes up right through the middle like this, so up and down, that's the Y-axis, and that's changing the height. So the ball or the camera, when we're moving the height up and down, that is on the Y-axis. Now moving on to rotation. Rotation can be a little bit more disorienting than translation. I think it's pretty easy to remember that, like, when I move something forward, this is Z, move it this way, move it up and down, this is Y. That's a pretty concrete and something you can see. Describing camera movement or motion or translating in that way. Rotation can be a little bit more difficult, and the way that I like to think about it, and the way that I memorize it, and the way that I'm going to try to teach you, is by just rotating your head. Everybody can rotate their head, so if you can memorize what each axis of rotation is based on your head, I think you'll be able to translate that back to your camera work. So let's start at the beginning. So say we want to rotate the camera like this. We're not going to talk about the word that is yet. We're going to get there in a little bit. So we want to rotate the camera like this. That's the same as rotating your head like that. And the way that we describe that type of rotation is called rotating on the Y-axis. So if you remember that with movement and translation, when something moves up and down, that's the Y-axis. Very important to remember. This is the Y-axis. So if you take that Y-axis and you put it through the top of your head or through the object, when you rotate on this axis, you're rotating like this. So you're looking left to right. Next, the most common is if you want to move the camera like this. We're not going to talk about the word just yet. You're rotating on the X-axis. So remember, the X-axis for motion is left to right. That same axis put through your head, and you rotate your head like this. That's rotating on the X-axis. Now the last one, and it's where we started for translation, is the Z-axis. So the Z-axis goes straight through like that. And if I put that axis through my head and I rotate, I'm going like this, effectively. And we're going to use this same metaphor when we go back to look at tripod heads and that sort of thing. It's very relevant there. So to wrap it all up, I know that this is overcomplicating camera movement and rotation to a lot of people, But if you're really serious about learning about camera movement and rotation, and this is especially important if you're working with both real world and CG and going back and forth, it's really important to understand this coordinate system and this axis labeling that goes along with it. So we're going to do a really quick wrap up, and I'm going to try to use some more 3D diagrams to help illustrate this later. So again, Z movement. Z movement goes this way. X movement goes this way. Y movement goes this way. And this is in and out, side to side, and up and down. Try to memorize that. It's not 100% crucial, but just know that that system exists if you need to be able to really, through language, describe a camera movement. You can very accurately do that with those coordinate systems. And then to wrap up for rotation, rotating on the y-axis is here. Rotating on the x-axis is like this. And rotating on the z-axis is like that. I hope that's helpful for you guys and not too disorienting, not too convoluted. But as we move on to looking at the tripod, we look at the dolly, and we look at the crane, we're now going to be able to describe what each one of those different types of camera supports do based on those coordinate systems.